Nina Boudreau had always found peace in the early mornings. The sun, just beginning to break over the horizon, painted everything in muted gold. The small garden outside their New Orleans home had become her sanctuary, where she would sip coffee, fingers tracing the edges of her favorite ceramic cup. It was a habit she had developed over the years, one that kept her centered amidst the chaos of the hospital where she worked as a neurosurgeon. The demands of her profession required a level of discipline and focus most could never imagine. And yet, here, in these precious quiet moments, it felt like she was just Nina, a woman with thoughts too heavy for even her skilled hands to hold. Her husband, Daniel, had still been asleep when she slipped out of bed that morning. His deep, even breaths filled the room, a familiar sound in the house they'd shared for nearly 15 years. They were the couple everyone admired. He, a successful entrepreneur with a polished charm, she, a well-respected doctor who had worked tirelessly to build her reputation. Together, they were an image of success and partnership. They threw holiday parties, hosted dinners, and supported each other publicly. Yet, recently, Nina had felt an undercurrent of something she couldn't name. A tension. A distance. As she stepped barefoot onto the cool grass, her phone buzzed. It was early for a call, especially on a Saturday. She glanced at the screen. Charlotte. A name that had begun to thread itself into her life in ways that felt too subtle to confront, but too persistent to ignore. Charlotte was Daniel's assistant, efficient, confident, and always present at his side during work events. "Good morning, Nina. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Charlotte's voice was smooth, like silk against glass. "No, not at all," Nina replied, forcing herself to sound natural. She hadn't expected to hear from her, especially not directly. "Is something wrong?" "Daniel's still asleep." There was a brief pause on the other end. "I'm just calling to confirm that Daniel will be attending the investor brunch later. I know it's the weekend, but with everything coming up, we need to stay on track." Nina frowned. Daniel hadn't mentioned any brunch. "I wasn't aware." "Are you sure it's today?" "Yes," Charlotte said quickly, too quickly. "It was finalized late last night. He probably didn't want to wake you. I'll let you two handle it. Have a good morning." Before Nina could respond, the line went dead. For a moment, she stood there, the cool breeze on her skin doing little to shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in her chest. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started, this sense that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way Daniel had become more distant lately, wrapped up in his business ventures, or how he'd smile at her in a way that felt more polite than genuine. Perhaps it was the long nights he claimed to be working, only to return home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. Nina shook her head, scolding herself for letting her mind wander down paths she had no business walking. Trust. That was the foundation of any marriage, she reminded herself. And she trusted Daniel. She had to. They had built a life together, one too solid to be shaken by mere suspicions. But as she stood there, staring at the garden that Daniel had once promised to help her tend to, something gnawed at her. A quiet, creeping suspicion that, despite the beautiful home, the flourishing careers, and the appearances they maintained, something was beginning to crumble. Something was slipping away, quietly, like sand between her fingers. Nina closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She couldn't allow herself to spiral, not over a vague sense of unease. Not over a phone call. But still, the question lingered in her mind as she walked back inside the house, the early morning light casting long shadows behind her. What wasn't Daniel telling her? The air between them shifted over the following weeks, like a season changing too slowly for anyone to notice, until one day you step outside and realize everything feels different. Daniel's usual warmth felt cooler, his smiles more measured, and Nina found herself tiptoeing around conversations that had once flowed easily. It wasn't anything she could put a finger on, nothing concrete. But Nina, with her finely tuned instincts, had learned to trust her gut in the operating room. Now, she wondered why it was so hard to trust herself at home. "Is something wrong?" she asked one evening, trying to sound casual. She was stirring the pasta on the stove while Daniel sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The sound of his fingers tapping against the screen grated on her nerves, though she wasn't sure why. Daniel didn't look up. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Nina began, carefully choosing her words. "You've just seemed distracted lately. I know work has been busy, but we've barely had a real conversation in weeks." Finally, he glanced up, his eyes searching hers with a mild expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm not distracted. I'm just focused on this new project. Once it's settled, everything will go back to normal. You know how these things are." Nina wanted to believe him, to let the unease in her chest dissipate with his reassurance. But the way he said it, the way he brushed off her concern, felt too easy. Too practiced. She watched him as he returned to his phone, his shoulders relaxed, as though the moment had already passed for him. She stirred the pasta again, though she'd already turned off the heat. She had always trusted Daniel, ever since they met in their 20s, each of them ambitious in their own way. His charm and confidence had drawn her in, making her believe that together they could conquer anything. He was the kind of man who knew how to make people feel seen, understood. But now, it felt as though she was looking at him through a glass window, unable to reach him. That night, as they lay side by side in bed, Daniel's breathing soon deepened into sleep. Nina remained awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence between them was deafening, and the unanswered questions circled her mind like vultures. Charlotte had called again earlier that week, a brief conversation about some event Daniel would need to attend. Nina had tried not to overthink it, had told herself she was being paranoid. But the more Charlotte's name came up, the more Nina noticed a pattern. When Daniel stayed late at work, Charlotte was always there. When he mentioned business trips, Charlotte was in charge of the arrangements. It wasn't the frequency of her involvement that bothered Nina, but the ease with which Daniel spoke of her, the way her name slipped into their conversations as if she belonged in the spaces between them. Nina had always been rational, logical. She wasn't one to give in to jealousy or unfounded suspicion. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't help but wonder, how much did she really know about what was happening in Daniel's life? What was happening behind those late nights and business meetings? The next morning, as Daniel prepared to leave for work, Nina watched him closely. He kissed her cheek absent-mindedly, his briefcase slung over one shoulder, his phone already in his hand as though he was more tethered to it than to her. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be late again tonight," he said, too casually. "Don't wait up for me." Nina nodded, her throat tight. "Another meeting?" "Yeah, last-minute thing. You know how it is." But she didn't know anymore. The man standing in front of her was the same Daniel she'd known for years, yet something about him had become unfamiliar. He was present, but in a way that felt far removed from the life they shared. As he walked out the door, a weight settled in her chest that Nina couldn't shake. She knew, deep down, that something was off, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of their quiet breakfast still scattered around her. She tried to replay their conversations in her mind, searching for clues, for signs of what she couldn't quite name. Was it just her imagination, or was there truly something slipping away between them? Nina's phone buzzed, and she glanced down. It was a message from her colleague at the hospital, reminding her of an upcoming surgery. For a moment, she allowed herself to be distracted by work, to bury herself in the one place where things still made sense. But even as she prepared for her day, the shadow of doubt lingered, refusing to be ignored. She could feel it growing, like a storm cloud on the horizon, dark and full of unanswered questions. And at the center of it all was Daniel, her husband, her partner, the one person she had always believed would never betray her trust. But now, she wasn't so sure. Nina found herself leaning into the distractions of work, immersing herself in the hospital's steady hum. There, everything was familiar, patients who relied on her hands to heal them, colleagues who respected her for her skill and clarity of thought. The sterile environment, with its crisp white coats and the mechanical rhythms of monitors, was a world of certainty. But every time she left the hospital and walked into the quiet of her home, the walls closed in, and the doubts resurfaced. It had been weeks since that conversation over pasta, but nothing had changed. If anything, Daniel seemed more distant. He no longer volunteered details about his day, brushing off her questions with vague answers or a distracted nod. And when he was home, his presence felt muted, as if the man who used to share in their late-night talks and Sunday morning breakfasts had left, replaced by someone she couldn't quite reach. One evening, as she sat in her car outside their house, her fingers hovered over her phone. She had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift, but instead of feeling relief as she approached home, there was only a tightness in her chest. She could feel the distance between her and Daniel, even through the walls of the house. She opened her phone and found herself staring at Charlotte's name in Daniel's call history, again. It wasn't just once or twice. It was frequent, almost daily. Nina tried to tell herself it made sense. Charlotte was his assistant, they had to be in constant communication for work. But late-night calls? Calls during their supposed date nights? It was harder and harder to ignore the little voice in her mind whispering that it wasn't as innocent as Daniel wanted her to believe. Nina placed her phone down and exhaled, resting her forehead on the steering wheel. "What are you doing?" she asked herself. She wasn't someone who jumped to conclusions, who let insecurity drive her actions. She was a surgeon, sharp, precise, logical. And yet, here she was, parked outside her own home, dreading the possibility of what she might find inside. When she finally opened the door and walked into the dimly lit house, she found Daniel in the living room, laptop open, staring intently at the screen. The light from the screen illuminated his face, casting shadows that made him look more like a stranger than her husband. "Hey," she said, walking in, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. Daniel barely glanced up. "Hey," he murmured, his eyes flickering back to the screen. He didn't ask about her day. He didn't offer a smile, or even a brief moment of connection. The distance between them felt like an ocean, vast and unbridgeable. Nina sat down on the couch across from him, watching as he continued typing. She couldn't take it anymore. "Daniel," she began slowly, trying to control the tremor in her voice, "what's going on with you?" He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but he didn't look at her. "What do you mean?" "You've been different. Distant. And I've tried to be understanding, but I feel like you're not being honest with me." She hesitated, then added softly, "Is it work? Is it something else?" He sighed, shutting his laptop with a quiet click, but still didn't meet her eyes. "Nina, I'm just tired. This new project is demanding a lot more of my attention than I thought. You've said that before, but it doesn't feel like it's just work. I'm your wife, Daniel. I need you to be honest with me. Is there something else going on? Is there someone else?" The question hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Finally, Daniel looked up, his face unreadable. "Why would you even ask that?" "Because I see the way things have changed between us," Nina said, her voice cracking slightly. "You're here, but you're not really here. We don't talk the way we used to. I can't shake the feeling that there's something you're not telling me." Daniel stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want me to say, Nina. I'm doing the best I can. I'm just trying to get through this phase." She watched him pace the room, frustration gnawing at her. "But what if it's not just a phase?" she asked quietly. "What if this is something more?" He stopped in his tracks and finally met her gaze. His eyes were weary, as though carrying a weight he wasn't willing to share. "There's nothing going on, Nina. You're imagining things." But Nina knew she wasn't imagining it. She could feel it, in the silences between them, in the way he avoided her questions, in the growing shadow of doubt that had become a constant presence in their marriage. Daniel walked past her toward the kitchen, leaving her sitting on the couch, feeling more alone than ever. She wanted to believe him, to cling to the man she had known for so long, but the cracks were starting to show. And no matter how hard she tried to hold on to the life they had built, she couldn't ignore the nagging certainty that something had already begun to unravel. As she sat there, staring at the closed laptop on the table, Nina felt a quiet resolve take hold. If Daniel wasn't going to tell her the truth, she would have to find it herself. Nina had always trusted herself to handle the truth, no matter how painful. That was the foundation of her work as a surgeon, facing reality with steady hands and a clear mind. But the truth she was about to confront in her marriage terrified her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the betrayal she feared. It was the confirmation that the life she thought she had, her love, her partnership, was an illusion. She had tried to ignore it, to tell herself that maybe Daniel really was just overwhelmed with work. But the seeds of doubt had been planted too deeply. And in the last few days, those seeds had sprouted into something undeniable. So that morning, while Daniel was in the shower, she found herself staring at his phone on the nightstand. She hadn't planned to look. But something within her, that quiet intuition that had been her guiding light for years, urged her forward. Her heart raced as she reached for the phone. Her hand hesitated just above it, trembling slightly. Am I really going to do this? She pressed the screen, feeling the cold smoothness of the glass. The phone was locked, but Daniel had never been secretive about his password. He was the kind of man who prided himself on transparency, or at least, that was what she'd always believed. She quickly typed in the numbers, and the screen unlocked with a small click. For a moment, she hesitated again, her fingers hovering above the messages icon. The reality of what she was about to do hit her like a wave. Once she crossed this line, there was no going back. With a deep breath, Nina opened his messages. The first few were harmless, work-related, exchanges with colleagues, brief updates from friends. But then she saw it, Charlotte. The message thread wasn't long, but it was filled with a quiet intimacy that cut through her like a knife. Can't wait to see you tonight, one message read, sent late last week. Asterisk thinking about our last trip. It was perfect. Asterisk. Her stomach twisted as she scrolled further. There it was, laid bare in front of her, the truth she had been trying to avoid. A string of messages, not just about work but about meetings in hotel rooms, stolen weekends, shared secrets. Each one felt like a small betrayal, piling up until they threatened to crush her. Nina's vision blurred as she continued reading, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just the fact that Daniel had been unfaithful, it was the realization of how deeply he had deceived her. The man she thought she knew, the life they had built together, now felt like a beautiful story crafted around a hidden lie. She placed the phone down just as Daniel walked out of the bathroom, a towel slung over his shoulders, his hair damp. He looked at her, noticing the phone in her hand, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, guilt, maybe. But it vanished just as quickly. Nina, he said, his voice steady, too steady. What are you doing? Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. I know. His body tensed. He took a step toward her, the air between them thick with unspoken words. What do you mean, you know? I saw the messages, she said, her voice cracking, but still strong. I know about you and Charlotte. For a long, agonizing moment, the room filled with silence. Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't rush to explain or offer excuses. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, as if he had been caught in something inevitable. I didn't want you to find out like this, he said softly, his voice laced with a kind of sadness that felt too late to matter. How did you expect me to find out? Nina asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Were you just going to keep lying to me? Keep pretending like we were okay? Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't plan for this to happen, Nina. It happened. I didn't mean to hurt you. Nina swallowed the bitter lump in her throat. But you did. She could see the guilt in his eyes now, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. But it wasn't enough. It didn't undo the months of deceit, the quiet betrayal she had lived with, unknowingly, all this time. Was it ever going to stop, she asked quietly. Or were you just going to let me keep believing we were happy while you carried on with her? He didn't answer right away, and his silence spoke volumes. Nina felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. She stood up, gathering the strength she had left. I gave you everything, Daniel. I trusted you. I loved you. And you threw it all away for what? For her? Daniel looked at her, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the bed. I never stopped loving you, Nina. She shook her head. Love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't feel like this. There was nothing left to say. The betrayal had hollowed out the space between them, leaving only fragments of the life they once shared. Nina knew, deep down, that there was no way to rebuild what had been shattered. The damage was done. Without another word, she walked out of the room, leaving Daniel sitting in the silence of his own making. As she closed the door behind her, the weight of the betrayal still heavy on her heart, Nina knew she had lost everything. But there was one thing she hadn't lost, herself. And that, she realized, was the one thing Daniel could never take away.